Adesuwa arrived at Baba Tund's compound with dust on her feet and hope trembling in her chest. The sun was high, cruel, and unforgiving, yet she stood quietly before the tall iron gate as though afraid to disturb it. Her small bag hung from her shoulder, light with possessions but heavy with dreams. She had been told this house would change her life, that work lived here, that survival was possible beyond its walls. The gate creaked open slowly, as if the compound itself was deciding whether to accept her. Mama Kimmy stood there, wrapped in fine fabric, her face calm but unreadable. Her eyes moved over Adesuwa the way one inspects goods in a market, carefully, coldly, without emotion. Baba Tund lingered behind her, his face stern, his silence louder than words. Somewhere inside the house, Solo watched from the shadows, sensing something he did not yet understand. Adesuwa bowed low, greeting them with the respect she had been taught since childhood. Her voice was soft when she spoke, careful not to offend, careful not to demand. She promised obedience, promised hard work, promised gratitude for even the smallest kindness. Mama Kimmy nodded slowly, already imagining how much labor this fragile body could endure. As Adesuwa stepped inside, the gate shut behind her with a final clang that echoed through the compound. The wind stirred, lifting dry leaves and spinning them briefly before letting them fall again. The ground seemed to sigh beneath her feet, as though it recognized the sorrow that had just entered. Somewhere unseen, a crow cried once, then disappeared into the sky. Adesuwa did not know it then, but the compound had claimed her, not as a worker alone, but as a witness. And witnesses, in that house, never lasted long. From the very first morning, Adesuwa learned that rest was a luxury she could not afford. Before the rooster crowed, Mama Kimmy's voice cut through the darkness, sharp and commanding. Adesuwa rose from her thin mat beside the kitchen, her bones aching, her eyes burning with sleep she was not allowed to finish. She swept the compound until blisters bloomed on her palms and fetched water until her arms shook. Food was something she prepared but rarely tasted. The aroma of stew filled the air, teasing her hunger, but Mama Kimmy's eyes ensured she never reached for more than leftovers. Hunger followed Adesuwa everywhere, curling in her stomach like a living thing. She learned to swallow it down along with her tears. At night, smoke clung to her clothes, to her hair, to her skin. She lay awake listening to the house breathe, doors creaking, footsteps moving softly, voices whispering when they believed no one could hear. Baba Tund passed her often without looking, as though her existence accused him of something he did not wish to confront. His silence was heavy, weighted with guilt he pretended not to feel. Sola noticed everything. He noticed how Adesuwa flinched at Mama Kimmy's footsteps, how her eyes avoided mirrors because she no longer recognized the girl staring back. Sometimes their eyes met, and in those moments, Adesuwa saw something close to regret. But regret never spoke, and silence never saved anyone. Aya Mornike, the old woman next door, watched from across the fence. She saw the sadness wrapped tightly around Adesuwa's shoulders like a second cloth. She heard Mama Kimmy's insults travel easily through the air, unashamed. One evening, she whispered to the earth, warning it to remember the girl's suffering, for the earth never forgets injustice. The house fed on silence, and Adesuwa was learning how loud silence could be. The rain had begun softly that night, as if the sky itself was uncertain, but it soon grew violent, beating the roof of Baba Tund's house with relentless fury. Water slipped through cracked edges and dripped steadily onto the kitchen floor where Adesuwa stood barefoot, shivering not from cold, but from an unease she could not name. Mama Kimmy had sent her to the storeroom to fetch palm oil, and though the task was simple, her heart felt unusually heavy as she walked down the narrow passage. The lamp flickered weakly as she approached the wooden door. Before her fingers touched the handle, voices drifted out, low and hurried, wrapped in secrecy. Adesuwa froze, her hand suspended in the air. She recognized Mama Kimmy's voice immediately, sharp, impatient, carrying authority even in whispers. Baba Tund answered her, his words slower, weighed down by fear that could not be hidden. Adesuwa pressed herself gently against the wall, her breathing shallow. She did not intend to listen, but the words pulled her in, refusing to let her go. She heard names she did not recognize, dates she did not understand, and then she heard something that made her knees weaken. Land. Papers. a man who had come asking questions and had been silenced. Mama Kemi spoke of him as though he were already forgotten, as though his life had been nothing more than an inconvenience. She described how his mouth had been too loud, how his footsteps had lingered where they were not welcome. Baba Tun's voice cracked as he spoke, his fears slipping through despite his attempts to sound strong. He worried about consequences, about spirits, about what the land might remember. That was when Mama Kemi laughed. It was not a loud laugh, nor a joyful one. It was low and controlled, the kind of laughter that lives only in people who believe they are untouchable. She said fire cleanses everything. She said fire does not talk. She said fire leaves no witnesses behind. Adesuwa felt her chest tighten as though a rope had been pulled around her heart. Her ears rang, and for a moment, the sound of the rain disappeared. She realized she was standing inside a secret soaked in blood and smoke. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to move. She wanted to forget, but her mind was already marked. A sudden creak betrayed her presence. The sound was small, almost harmless, but it shattered the night like thunder. Mama Kemi stopped speaking. Baba Tund went silent. The rain seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, Mama Kemi turned toward the door. Her eyes met Adesuwa's through the darkness, sharp and burning, filled with a cold understanding that left no room for mercy. In that instant, Adesuwa knew she had crossed a line that could not be erased. She did not need to hear the accusation spoken aloud. It was written clearly on Mama Kemi's face. Adesuwa dropped to her knees before her fear could stop her. Her body shook as though struck by invisible hands. Tears poured freely, soaking the ground beneath her. She begged in broken words, swearing that she had heard nothing, promising silence, offering her life in exchange for mercy. She spoke of her mother, of hunger, of dreams she had not yet lived. Baba Tun stood rooted to the spot, his hands trembling at his sides. His eyes flickered between his wife and the girl on the floor, torn between fear and conscience. He opened his mouth as though to speak, then closed it again, the words dying before they could escape. Sola stood in the corridor, unseen by the others. His heart pounded so loudly he feared it would give him away. He watched Adesuwa cry, watched his mother's face harden like stone. Something inside him cracked, something that would never heal. Mama Kemi said nothing. She simply stared at Adesuwa for a long moment, her expression calm, calculating. Then she turned away, as though the girl no longer existed. The decision had been made in silence, sealed without words. Later that night, Adesuwa lay awake beside the kitchen, her eyes wide and unblinking. Sleep would not come. The rain had stopped, but the house felt louder than ever. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every sound felt like a warning. Her gaze rested on the pile of firewood stacked neatly against the wall. In the faint glow of the dying lamp, the wood seemed to shimmer, remembering other flames, other screams. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. The wind whispered through the cracks in the wall, carrying a message she did not yet understand. The earth beneath the house shifted slightly, as though acknowledging a promise it would one day fulfill. Adesuwa pressed her hands to her chest, trying to quiet her racing heart. Somewhere deep inside her, fear turned slowly into something else, something heavy, something final. The fire had been chosen. And when fire is chosen, innocence is never spared. Morning came without kindness. The sun rose slowly, pale and watchful, casting long shadows across Baba Tund's compound as though it already knew what would happen before nightfall. Adesuwa woke with a start, her body stiff from fear rather than sleep. Her eyes burned, heavy from tears she had cried into silence, yet the house showed her no sympathy. Mama Kemi's voice arrived sharp and early, slicing through the air like a blade. She was given more work than usual that day, tasks piled upon tasks until her arms shook and her legs begged to collapse. She scrubbed floors until her fingers bled, washed clothes until her back screamed, and fetched water again and again until the world blurred before her eyes. Mama Kemi watched everything with cold satisfaction, correcting nothing, encouraging nothing, simply waiting. Baba Tund avoided her completely. When Adesuwa passed him, carrying heavy loads on her head, he turned his face away as though blindness could erase guilt. His silence grew heavier with every step she took. Sola tried to speak to her once, his lips parting as though to warn her, but Mama Kemi's sudden appearance froze the words in his throat. By afternoon, Adesuwa noticed preparations that made her stomach tighten. Firewood was being moved closer to the kitchen, stacked higher than usual. Kerosene was brought out and placed where it could be easily reached. Mama Kimmy moved through the house with strange calm, humming softly as she worked. The sound chilled Adesuwa more than shouting ever could. When Adesuwa asked quietly why so much firewood was needed, Mama Kimmy turned slowly and smiled. It was not a smile of warmth, but one that carried finality. She told Adesuwa the night would be cold, that the fire must burn long. The words sank deep into Adesuwa's bones, heavy with meaning she could not escape. As evening approached, the sky darkened quickly, clouds gathering low and thick. The wind rose, carrying the smell of dry wood and kerosene. Aya Mornike stood at her doorway, watching the compound with growing dread. She felt a disturbance in the air, a wrongness that made her chest ache. She whispered a prayer to the earth, begging it to remember what humans tried to erase. Inside the house, Mama Kimmy called Adesuwa into the kitchen. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, and that softness frightened Adesuwa more than cruelty. She obeyed, her legs weak, her heart pounding as though it already sensed the end. The door closed behind them, and with that sound, Mercy left the house. The kitchen smelled of kerosene and smoke, thick and suffocating. Mama Kimmy instructed Adesuwa to light the fire, claiming the evening meal must be prepared quickly. Adesuwa's hands shook as she struck the match, the flame dancing briefly before catching the wood. The fire crackled softly at first, innocent in its hunger. As Adesuwa bent close, Mama Kimmy moved behind her. The world changed in an instant. A sudden push sent Adesuwa stumbling forward, her scream ripping through the air as flames leapt greedily toward her clothes. Pain exploded across her skin, sharp and unbearable. She cried out for help, her voice tearing itself apart. Baba Tund rushed in, his eyes wide with horror. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he might act, might save her. But Mama Kimmy's gaze met his, cold and commanding. His feet froze. His hands fell to his sides. His silence became a sentence. Sola ran toward the kitchen, drawn by the screams, but Mama Kimmy shoved him back, ordering him to stay where he was. Tears streamed down his face as he watched from the doorway, helpless, terrified, forever changed. Adesuwa's cries echoed through the compound, bouncing off walls that refused to listen. The fire roared now, fed by kerosene and fear. Adesuwa collapsed, her body writhing in agony. Her pleas grew weaker, her voice breaking until only sobs remained. In her final moments, her eyes searched the room, not for vengeance, but for one sign of mercy. None came. When the flames finally died down, silence settled heavily over the kitchen. The smell of burnt flesh hung in the air, thick and unforgettable. Mama Kimmy stood still, watching the remains without expression. Baba Tund turned away, vomiting into the dirt, his soul splintering beyond repair. The fire had spoken, and the house would never forget its words. The night Adesuwa died did not end when the fire went out. Darkness wrapped itself around Baba Tund's compound like a mourning cloth, heavy and suffocating. The air smelled of ash and something far worse, something that clung to the walls and refused to leave. Crickets fell silent, and even the wind seemed afraid to pass through the gate. Before dawn, Baba Tund and Mama Kimmy moved like thieves within their own home. No lamps were lit. No prayers were said. They wrapped what remained of Adesuwa's body in an old sack, the same kind used for carrying firewood. Baba Tund's hands shook as he tied the knots, his tears falling silently onto the dirt. Mama Kimmy watched him with impatience, urging him to hurry, reminding him that daylight was dangerous. They carried her to the back of the compound where the soil was loose and already scarred by neglect. The earth was cold and unwelcoming. As Baba Tund dug, his breath came in shallow gasps, each strike of the hoe echoing like a confession. Mama Kimmy stood over him, scanning the darkness, her heart beating fast not with regret, but with fear of being discovered. When they lowered Adesuwa into the shallow grave, something strange happened. The wind rose suddenly, circling the pit in a slow, deliberate dance. Baba Tund froze, his grip tightening on the hoe. Mama Kimmy hissed at him to continue, her voice sharp but uncertain. The earth seemed to resist being closed, as though it refused to accept the lie being buried within it. Sola watched from his window, his small hands gripping the wooden frame until his knuckles turned white. Tears streamed down his face as he witnessed the final erasure of the girl who had suffered silently beside him. He wanted to scream, to run, to stop them, but fear rooted him to the spot. In that moment, his childhood ended. By the time the grave was covered, the sky had begun to pale. Mama Kimmy stamped the soil flat with her foot, as though pressing down the truth itself. She warned Baba Tund and Solo with cold finality that no one must ever speak of Adesuwa again. Her name, she said, must die with her body. But the earth does not forget names. That very night, the house began to change. The air grew heavy, thick with a presence that could not be seen but could be felt. Flames flickered briefly in the kitchen hearth, though no fire had been lit. The sound of soft footsteps echoed through empty corridors, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside closed doors. Solo woke screaming, drenched in sweat. In his dream, Adesuwa stood at the foot of his bed, her skin unburnt, her eyes deep and sorrowful. She did not speak, but her gaze carried a question that crushed his heart. When he reached out to her, she faded like smoke, leaving behind the smell of ash. Baba Tund could not sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the fire again, heard Adesuwa's cries tearing through his chest. His body weakened with guilt, his spirit hollowed out. Mama Kimmy pretended not to notice, but even she began to sense it. The way shadows lingered too long, the way the kitchen fire whispered when no one was near. Aya Mornike felt the disturbance from her home. She woke suddenly, pressing her palm against the earth. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered ancient words passed down by her ancestors. She knew a restless soul had been wronged, and that such souls never leave quietly. Adesuwa's spirit lingered, bound not by hatred alone, but by injustice too deep to ignore. The flames that killed her had not destroyed her voice. They had given it another form. She did not come in rage at first. She came in sorrow, and sorrow, when ignored, becomes something far more dangerous. The first sign came quietly, almost gently, as though whatever lingered in the house did not yet wish to be noticed. Mama Kimmy woke before dawn to the sound of water dripping steadily onto the kitchen floor. Annoyed, she rose from her bed, muttering under her breath, certain it was another careless mistake left behind by no one. When she entered the kitchen, she stopped short. The tap was dry, the floor clean, yet the sound continued, slow and deliberate, drop after drop, echoing from the darkness. She stood there for a long moment, listening, her heartbeat loud in her ears. When the sound stopped suddenly, the silence felt heavier than noise. Mama Kimmy shook her head, blaming tiredness, but something cold had already settled in her chest. She returned to her room without turning off the lamp, a small act of fear she refused to acknowledge. Later that morning, Baba Tund discovered footprints in the ash beside the hearth. Small, bare footprints, clear and fresh, leading from the kitchen door toward the inner rooms. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at them, his knees weakening beneath him. He called Mama Kimmy, his voice shaking despite his effort to sound calm. She looked once and quickly wiped the ash away with her wrapper, her movements angry and rough. She warned him sharply not to imagine things, not to invite trouble with weak thoughts. But her hands trembled as she spoke, and she avoided looking back at the hearth. Baba Tund said nothing more. Fear had begun to speak where words failed. Sola stopped sleeping altogether. Every night, he heard soft movements outside his door, the faint dragging sound of something unseen. Sometimes he smelled smoke, thick and choking, even though the kitchen fire was long cold. He buried his face in his pillow and prayed, whispering apologies into the darkness until his voice broke. The house itself seemed to respond. Doors creaked open on their own. Lamps flickered and died without reason. The walls grew damp, as though soaked in grief. Mama Kimmy scolded the house helps in nearby compounds for spreading rumors, but whispers still traveled through the village like harmattan wind. Aya Mornike watched Baba Tund's compound with sorrowful certainty. She saw shadows moving where no bodies stood. One evening, she heard a girl crying softly behind the house, the sound thin and broken, carried by the wind. She knew then that Adesuwa had not gone far. That night, Mama Kimmy heard her name spoken for the first time. It came from the kitchen, soft and burning at once. The voice was weak, cracked, but unmistakable. Mama Kimmy sat upright in bed, her breath shallow, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. She told herself it was memory, guilt, imagination. But deep inside, she knew, the dead had begun to walk, and Adesuwa was no longer asking to be heard. The night arrived thick with unease, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds as though the sky itself did not wish to witness what was coming. Baba Tun's compound sat unnaturally quiet, every sound swallowed by the darkness. Inside the house, Mama Kimmy sat awake on her bed, her eyes fixed on the door, her wrapper pulled tightly around her body. Sleep had abandoned her days ago, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the growing weight of fear. A sudden cold swept through the room, sharp and unnatural. The lamp flame flickered violently, stretching long shadows across the walls. Mama Kimmy whispered a prayer under her breath, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound strong. That was when she smelled it, the unmistakable scent of smoke, thick and choking, as though a fire had just been put out. The door creaked open slowly. Mama Kimmy's breath caught in her throat as a figure stepped inside, moving with a calm that chilled her bones. The girl stood barefoot on the floor, her form glowing faintly in the dim light. Her skin was smooth and unburnt, yet her eyes told a different story, deep, dark, filled with sorrow and pain that had no end. Mama Kimmy knew those eyes. Mama Kimmy knew those eyes. Adesuwa. The name escaped her lips before she could stop it. The spirit did not speak at first. She only looked at Mama Kimmy, her gaze heavy with memories that refused to die. Images flooded Mama Kimmy's mind. Adesuwa kneeling, begging, burning, screaming. Mama Kimmy clutched her chest, gasping for air as though the fire had returned to claim her. Baba Tund burst into the room, drawn by his wife's strangled cry. The moment his eyes fell on the figure standing there, his legs gave way beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, weeping openly, his body shaking with fear and regret. He called Adesuwa's name again and again, begging for forgiveness that came far too late. Sola stood frozen at the doorway, tears streaming down his face. Adesuwa turned to him, her gaze softening for the briefest moment. In that look lived forgiveness mixed with sorrow, a reminder of what silence had cost them both. Sola fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The spirit finally spoke, her voice low and echoing, as though carried by fire and wind together. She asked why they had chosen fire. She asked why her life had been so easy to erase. Her words were not loud, yet they cut deeper than any scream. The lamp went out suddenly, plunging the room into darkness. When light returned, Adesuwa was gone. Only the smell of smoke remained, curling through the air like a warning. Mama Kimmy lay trembling on the bed, her strength drained. Baba Tund wept quietly on the floor. Sola stared at the place where Adesuwa had stood, his heart shattered beyond repair. The house fell silent once more, but the silence no longer belonged to the living. The nights grew longer after that first appearance, stretching thin and unyielding over Baba Tund's compound. No one could sleep. Doors creaked open on their own, lamps flickered as though breathing, and shadows stretched across walls like fingers reaching for the guilty. Every corner of the house carried a quiet hum. The sound of sorrow transformed into menace. Adesuwa's spirit was no longer just watching. She was moving, flowing through the house like smoke, unseen yet deeply felt. Mama Kimmy awoke one night to the soft whisper of her name. It was not loud, but it vibrated in her chest, each syllable heavy with accusation. She sat up, heart hammering, eyes scanning the dark room, but there was nothing to see. The whispers repeated, growing louder with each passing minute, circling the walls, following her from room to room. She ran to the kitchen, certain someone had entered, but it was empty. The smell of burnt wood and ash lingered thick in the air, a memory she could not shake. Baba Tund tried to reason, tried to convince himself it was fear, imagination, punishment for a guilty conscience. But when he poured water into the empty sink, he noticed the drops moving in reverse, climbing the sides as if defying nature itself. His knees buckled. He fell to the floor, tears streaming, murmuring prayers his tongue could barely form. The house had begun to speak in a language only the guilty could understand, and it demanded answers they did not have. Sola had stopped sleeping entirely. He wandered the corridors at night, clutching his mother's hand only to find it empty when he woke. He could hear Adesuwa's voice sometimes, soft, sorrowful, echoing with a longing that burned into his chest. "Why?" she would whisper, over and over, until he shivered uncontrollably. His dreams were filled with flames that did not consume, and shadows that whispered truths no child should ever know. Every night, he felt her presence closer, tangible, impossible to escape. Even the house seemed to join in her vigil. Windows rattled without wind, ceilings groaned when no weight pressed upon them, and the floorboards whispered under invisible feet. The firewood she had dyed overglowed faintly at night, a reminder of the agony that had birthed her vengeance. The air itself felt alive, charged with sorrow and rage, and those who had caused it could not hide. Every heartbeat of the guilty thudded in sync with Adesuwa's silent demands for justice. Aya Mornike sensed the shift as well, sitting outside her own home in the cool night air. She pressed her palm to the earth, feeling tremors, as though the soil itself remembered the injustice committed. She whispered prayers of protection, calling on ancestors and spirits older than the village itself. "She will not rest," she murmured, "and you cannot run from her." That night, Mama Kimi's screams echoed through the village. Doors in the compound banged open and shut on their own, and the kitchen lamps flared to life without fire. Something moved in the dark, small shadows, fleeting glimpses, the faint outline of a girl whose face carried sorrow too deep for the living to bear. Adesuwa's spirit had stepped out of silence. She no longer waited. She had begun to reclaim what was stolen from her: fear, guilt, and the truth. And in the quiet, the guilty learned something every wrongdoer must eventually face. No sin, no matter how carefully hidden, ever dies quietly. The night was thick with tension, as though the air itself had grown heavy with waiting. The moon, hidden behind layers of clouds, left the compound in near-complete darkness, and the wind whispered through the trees with a soft, sorrowful wail. Inside the house, Mama Kimi lay wide-eyed in bed, wrapped in her sheets, listening to the faintest noises, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of cloth, a soft sigh drifting through the corridors. She had thought herself clever, untouchable, but cleverness had no power against what Adesuwa had become. A sudden flicker drew her gaze to the kitchen. The lamp she had extinguished hours ago now burned faintly, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. Flames, small at first, began to lick the edges of the firewood pile, moving as if alive, independent of any human hand. Mama Kimi froze, a scream trapped in her throat. She wanted to call for Baba Tund, for Sola, for anyone, but her voice betrayed her, leaving her paralyzed. Baba Tund, awakened by the low hum of flames, stumbled toward the kitchen. As he approached, the smell of smoke filled his lungs before he could see the fire. He recoiled, clutching his chest as memories of Adesuwa's screams tore through him. The flames burned bright, yet gave no heat, as though they existed in some otherworldly space. From them, a form began to emerge, a faint, glowing silhouette of Adesuwa, her eyes deep pools of sorrow and silent fury. Sola appeared at the door, unable to tear his eyes away from the apparition. He saw her fully for the first time, burnt yet unscathed, small yet towering, fragile yet commanding. Her presence filled the room, bending the air with grief and power. She did not speak at first, but her gaze pierced each member of the family, showing them the truth they had buried alongside her body. Each heartbeat in the room echoed her silent demand: remember, suffer, understand. Mama Kimi fell to her knees, gasping and clawing at the floor as the shadows danced around her. Baba Tund fell beside her, his tears wetting the ground, his body racked with guilt. Sola cried out, holding his head, begging silently for forgiveness he could not give. The fire grew taller, surrounding Adesuwa's form like a protective cocoon, glowing brighter with every plea that went unanswered. Adesuwa finally spoke, her voice a whisper that carried through the entire house, yet it resonated as if it came from everywhere at once. "You thought fire would end me," she said, her tone neither angry nor cruel, but full of the weight of sorrow that had been stolen from her. "You thought death could silence truth. But the earth remembers. I remember, and I will not rest until the scales are balanced." The flames began to twist and writhe, forming shapes of memory. Her pleas for mercy, her begging as her body burned, the faces of the people who watched without helping. Each memory rose in fiery torment around Mama Kimi and Baba Tund, forcing them to see what they had done, relive it, and feel every moment as though it were happening again. Sola collapsed, tears streaming freely, unable to bear the weight of the truth, but even he knew she had a right to this vengeance. Then, as suddenly as they had risen, the flames died down, leaving behind nothing but the faint smell of smoke and the heavy silence of guilt. Adesuwa's form faded, but the house still quivered, still carried her presence, still whispered her name in every corner. The family sat trembling, knowing that what had happened was only the beginning. The girl they had burned was not gone. She was waiting, remembering, and preparing. The night closed in, heavier than before, and outside the compound, Aya Mornike felt it. She pressed her hand to the earth, whispered a prayer, and knew with certainty that Adesuwa's spirit would not stop. Fire had returned to claim more than wood. It had returned to claim justice. The days that followed were heavier than nights. Baba Tund moved through the compound as though carrying 1,000 invisible weights, each step hesitant, fearful, almost afraid the ground itself might rise against him. Mama Kimmy no longer slept. Her nights were spent pacing rooms that smelled faintly of smoke, her eyes darting at every shadow, her ears straining for the faintest whisper. Even Sola, whose youth had been a shield, now wandered the corridors in silence, haunted by the flickering memory of Adesuwa's gaze. It began with small things. Doors left open when no one had entered, lamps extinguished mid-lighting, water dripping when no faucet was running. Shadows moved too fast or too deliberately, curling along walls in ways that defied reason. Footsteps echoed in the hallways when no one stood there. The family began to hear faint crying at night, so soft and sorrowful it could have been mistaken for wind. But those who dared to follow it found nothing but empty rooms and lingering smoke. One evening, as Mama Kimmy stirred the evening stew, the firewood on the hearth ignited without warning. Flames licked the edges of the kitchen, but no heat came. From the glow emerged Adesuwa's faint silhouette, her small frame towering with the weight of her grief. Her eyes were pools of sorrow, yet they burned with something the living could not endure, the knowledge of betrayal and the hunger for justice. Mama Kimmy stumbled back, falling to her knees, clutching her chest as though trying to squeeze her beating heart into silence. Baba Tund cried out, too late, as the flames danced and twisted, forming fleeting images of the girl's suffering, each one sharper than the last. Sola could not look away. He watched her glide through the kitchen, moving with an unnatural grace. She walked among them as if part of the air itself, yet heavier, dense with sorrow and accusation. Every step she took was a memory made tangible. The begging, the humiliation, the fire that had stolen her body. The children of the village who had once laughed at her naivety, the neighbors who looked away, the silence that enabled cruelty. They were all there, bound in the echoes that now consumed the family. That night, Mama Kimmy finally screamed, a sound raw and broken, echoing through the village. Baba Tund covered his face, unable to reconcile the horror with the life he thought he had controlled. Even Sola, whose heart had always been the most innocent, felt it cracking under the pressure of unbearable truth. Adesuwa's voice rose faintly above them all, soft yet impossibly clear. I am not gone. You cannot hide from what you have done. Outside, Aya Mornike felt the energy shift through the soil once again. She pressed her hand to the earth, feeling tremors, and whispered the prayers of the old ones. The girl will take nothing lightly. The fire will speak where humans fail. Watch and learn the weight of injustice. Even from a distance, the world seemed to know that justice had begun walking among the living. The house itself shivered. Every wall, every floorboard, every shutter carried the memory of betrayal. And in the corner of each room, unseen but felt, Adesuwa lingered. She was patient. She was relentless. She was fire and sorrow, waiting for the moment the family would truly understand the cost of their sin. The nights grew unbearable. Each creak, each whisper, each flicker of shadow reminded Mama Kimmy and Baba Tund that the girl they had destroyed was not gone. They lived in a constant state of dread, flinching at every sound, their hearts racing with guilt that no denial could erase. Sola slept less and less. His small frame curled on the floor beside his bed, muttering prayers and begging for mercy he did not dare ask aloud. The house itself seemed alive, walls breathing, shadows twisting and stretching as though mocking its occupants. It began with the mirrors. Every reflective surface in the house began to distort their images, showing not their faces, but Adesuwa's. Her eyes stared from the glass with quiet accusation, tears etched into her cheeks, flames licking the edges of her form. Mama Kimmy saw herself in the mirrors screaming, trapped in that burning kitchen with Adesuwa's cries piercing her soul. She ran from room to room, but each mirror she passed repeated the same image. Baba Tund, too, could not escape. In every reflection, he saw the last moments of her life, the pleading, the agony, the fire, and his chest tightened with suffocating guilt. Then came the whispers. At first, they were soft, almost gentle, as if she were calling them to understand her pain. Why? The voice asked, echoing through the empty hallways. It grew louder each night, winding through the walls, following them into every room. The whispers were never alone. Faint footsteps accompanied them, pacing just outside doors, circling the family, counting their fear. Sola hid under his blanket, shaking, hearing the slow rhythm of what he knew was coming, a reckoning that could not be stopped. Adesuwa's presence became visible at times, faint, shadowy, almost ethereal, but every glimpse terrified them completely. Objects moved on their own. Chairs tipped over, pots clanged to the floor, and the scent of smoke filled the house even when no fire burned. The firewood she had dyed over glimmered faintly, glowing as though keeping watch, reminding them of the beginning of their crime. Each flicker, each echo, each motion carried a silent accusation. You burned me. You buried me. You thought it was over. One night, as they huddled together in the main hall, Adesuwa's figure appeared fully. She hovered above the ground, small yet powerful, her eyes unblinking pools of sorrow and fury. Mama Kimmy's knees buckled. She covered her face, weeping as if her tears could wash away her crimes. Baba Tund fell forward, clutching the floorboards, his body racked with sobs. Sola whispered a broken apology, his voice shaking as he pleaded for forgiveness. Adesuwa raised a hand slowly, and the firewood by the hearth burst into flames once more. Yet this time the fire did not harm her. It only burned around them, encircling the guilty. Each spark carried a memory of pain, each lick of flame a silent retelling of the injustice she had endured. Their screams filled the house, but she did not stop. She did not speak again. Her gaze, her presence, her fire was enough. The weight of her sorrow pressed into their hearts, burning far deeper than any flame ever could. Outside, Aya Mornike's old ears caught the sound of their cries. She pressed her hands to the earth, feeling the force of the restless spirit, and whispered, "The girl will not rest. Only the truth will free them, and it will cost them dearly." The wind carried the echoes of Adesuwa's judgment through the village, warning anyone who thought cruelty could be hidden. Wrongs do not die quietly. The night closed over the compound like a shroud, but it was no longer peaceful darkness. It was a darkness alive with accusation, with sorrow, and with fire that remembered. Adesuwa had begun her justice, and it would not be denied. By the next night, the house had grown alien to its own residents. Every corner seemed to breathe, every shadow twisted unnaturally, stretching longer than it should. Baba Tund could no longer sit without feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon him. Mama Kimmy moved with caution, her every step measured, as though the floor might rise to betray her. Even Sola trembled, feeling the pull of a presence that seemed to seep from the walls themselves, from the very air he breathed. Adesuwa appeared again, more solid now, her form flickering with an unnatural glow. She did not speak at first. She simply walked through the house, and wherever she passed, shadows moved like liquid, coiling around the guilty, pressing against their legs and hearts. The mirrors reflected her image endlessly, each reflection showing her as she had been burned, screaming, pleading, and finally, staring into the eyes of those who had silenced her. Each reflection added weight, a new layer of unbearable memory. Mama Kimmy dropped to the floor, screaming into the darkness, clawing at the shadows as though she could tear them away from her. But the shadows did not leave. They twisted tighter around her limbs, pressing her down with the force of centuries of stolen voices. Baba Tund collapsed beside her, his hands clutching at the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Every breath was an effort, every heartbeat a drum of guilt he could no longer ignore. Sola hid his face in his hands, but the shadows found him too, brushing against his skin, whispering words he could not fully comprehend, words full of sorrow and accusation. The kitchen, once the place of her death, became a stage of judgment. Flames ignited without warning, licking along the walls, curling around chairs and tables without consuming them. Adesuwa's form hovered above the hearth, small yet vast with sorrow and power. She raised her hand slowly, and the flames danced in patterns that told the story of her suffering. The pleading she had done, the begging ignored, the fire that took her body. Each spark burned with memory, searing their minds with truth they had tried to hide. Outside, Ayamornike pressed her hands to the earth again. She could feel the pulse of Adesuwa's spirit radiating outward, reaching beyond the compound to touch the village itself. She whispered the old prayers, calling on the ancestors to witness, to protect, and to ensure that justice, once awakened, could not be silenced. The wind carried the voice of the restless girl, weaving through the trees, rustling the leaves like the whispers of the wronged, warning all that cruelty is never invisible. By the time the night ended, the family was broken, not just in body, but in spirit. Mama Kemi trembled uncontrollably. Baba Tun's tears had left his cheeks raw, and Sola could barely move from fear and grief. The house itself seemed changed, hollow, aware, a vessel of memory and pain. Adesuwa's presence had not left, though her form faded. The shadows lingered, long and menacing, ensuring that the living could never forget the cost of their sins. And somewhere, deep in the dark corners of the compound, a faint whisper echoed repeatedly, "I am not gone. You cannot hide from me. You will remember." The terror that Adesuwa carried no longer belonged only to the house. Her presence seeped outward, into the compound, into the village, into every heart that had ever been blind to her suffering. The winds that passed over Baba Tun's land carried a faint smell of smoke, of charred wood, and of something that made even the strongest men pause mid-step. Villagers whispered to one another of strange lights flickering in the compound at night, of shadows moving without bodies, of soft crying that could be heard but never located. Children stopped playing near the house, and even the animals avoided it, their instincts screaming warnings that humans refused to heed. Inside the house, Adesuwa's spirit became bolder. She appeared in the hallways when no one expected, a faint glow that made walls bend unnaturally, casting shadows that reached out like hands. Mama Kemi tried to run from the rooms she thought were safe, but each doorway brought her face to face with the girl she had burned. The mirrors reflected her screams endlessly, replaying the night of Adesuwa's death as though it were happening again, each reflection more vivid, more horrifying than the last. Baba Tund tried to block his ears against the whispers, but they wrapped around him, naming every betrayal, every lie, every hidden act. Sola could barely walk without seeing her. At night, he would sit on the floor, clutching himself as Adesuwa appeared at the foot of his bed. He could feel her sorrow pressing down on him like a weight too heavy for a child to bear. Yet, in those moments, there was something more than anger in her gaze, a quiet demand for recognition, for justice, for the truth of her suffering to be acknowledged. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence alone filled the house with a grief so powerful that it cracked the walls of the guilty, layer by layer. The villagers began noticing subtle changes beyond the compound. Crops near the boundary shriveled without reason. Animals refused to enter the fields. Even the river that ran through the village seemed restless, churning at night as if stirred by invisible hands. Rumors grew of a girl who had been wronged and would not rest, and while fear grew in whispers, few dared speak openly. Those who did try to mock the story found themselves trembling at the faintest sound, imagining shadows where none existed. Mama Kemi and Baba Tund were no longer living. They were surviving. Every glance, every movement, every step reminded them that what they had done would not leave quietly. The fire that claimed Adesuwa had not ended with her body. It had transformed, spreading beyond the material world, touching hearts and bending reality. Shadows stretched longer, whispers grew louder, and every heartbeat in the house matched the rhythm of her sorrow. Ayamornike, sensing the unrest, pressed her palm to the earth once again. She whispered for protection, for patience, for courage, but even she knew some forces could not be contained. Adesuwa's grief had grown into something greater than fear, something older than time, and the world was beginning to bow to it. The night had begun, and no one could deny it. The fire had returned, and it would not be silent. The house had become a place of shadows and whispers, a prison for those who had sinned too deeply to be forgiven. Mama Kemi could no longer leave her room without seeing Adesuwa's form appear in the corners of her eyes. Each time she looked directly, the girl's face would vanish, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and the echo of a scream. Baba Tund tried to speak, to apologize, but his words faltered into the heavy silence of fear. Sola could only crouch on the floor, shaking, knowing that the spirit that haunted them was no longer patient. It began with small punishments. One night, as Mama Kimi carried water from the well, the bucket slipped from her hands, scattering water across the yard. She bent to retrieve it, only to see the shadow of Adesuwa flickering against the walls. The next morning, she found scorch marks trailing from the well to the house, as if the fire had followed her steps, marking her path, reminding her of what she had done. Every act of negligence, every lapse in attention, every small fear was met with subtle, chilling reminders of her crime. Baba Tun's punishment took a different form. Objects he touched fell or shifted on their own. When he lit a lamp, it flared with an unnatural wind, leaving soot and ash on his hands, a lingering taste of smoke in his mouth. His nightmares became unbearable. Every time he closed his eyes, he relived the night of Adesuwa's death, the smell of burning, the pleading in her voice, the helplessness of Sola frozen in the doorway. Each repetition was a blade, slicing deeper into his mind, stripping him of the comfort he thought he had. Sola, though young, could not escape the spirit's judgment either. At night, Adesuwa appeared at the foot of his bed, silently staring. His dreams became a maze of smoke and fire, where he wandered endlessly, searching for her, failing to find her, and hearing her whispered question, "Why did you watch and do nothing?" The weight of her sorrow pressed into him, shaping him into someone who could never ignore injustice again. His innocence was being stripped away, piece by piece, by the memory of the girl they had burned. The fire itself became a weapon of reminder. The kitchen, once the site of her death, would flare spontaneously, flames dancing across surfaces without harm, forming shapes of Adesuwa's body pleading, screaming, burning. Each spark, each flicker of smoke, replayed the horrors that had been ignored. Every night, Mama Kimi and Baba Tund could not hide. Each room, each doorway, each shadow reminded them that they had invited their own destruction. Outside, the village felt it too. Aya Mornike sensed tremors in the earth, whispers riding the wind, and the faint glow of fire that had no source. She whispered urgently for protection, calling on the ancestors to bear witness. She knew that this was not a simple haunting. It was a reckoning, a lesson carved into the living world by the hand of a spirit wronged beyond measure. Adesuwa's vengeance had begun to take form, and it would not stop until justice had been fully felt. The night ended with the family huddled together in the main hall, trembling, unable to speak. Adesuwa's form lingered, flickering faintly in the shadows. Her gaze did not waver. Her presence demanded acknowledgement, demanded memory, demanded a reckoning they could not escape. And as they shivered in fear, they knew this was only the beginning. The air was thick with dread, heavier than any living soul could bear. That night, the house seemed alive, walls breathing, floorboards quivering with the memory of fire. Mama Kimi sat shivering on her bed, wrapped in her wrapper, her teeth chattering despite the warmth of the room. Baba Tund crouched in the corner, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers he barely remembered, while Sola huddled beside him, trembling, feeling the eyes of something unseen pressing into his soul. The first strike came suddenly. A chair in the main hall lifted off the floor as if invisible hands had seized it. Mama Kimi screamed, but the sound caught in her throat. The chair slammed back down with a force that rattled the windows, leaving her no doubt. She was being watched, punished, and hunted. The shadows stretched longer, curling around her legs, tightening like ropes made of darkness, and she felt a pain she could not name pressing into her chest. Baba Tund was next. The lamp beside him flared violently, bursting into a small, contained flame that seemed to twist in the air, forming the shape of Adesuwa as she had burned, small, terrified, pleading. His heart raced uncontrollably. He fell to his knees, clutching the ground, as invisible hands pressed into his shoulders and chest. The memories came back with unbearable clarity, the pleading, the fire, her screams. He tried to speak, tried to beg, but the voice that rose from his throat sounded alien to him, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Sola, too, could not escape. The shadows in his room stretched and twisted into forms that resembled her, tall, small, human, and otherworldly at once. They circled him, whispering words of sorrow and accusation. "Why?" they breathed. "Why did you not help?" His small hands covered his ears, but the voice penetrated, weaving into his very thoughts. He felt the weight of her suffering as if it were physically pressing down on him, burning yet cold, leaving marks on his soul that no time could erase. Mama Kimmy and Baba Tund tried to flee, but the doors slammed shut, locks clicking into place as though guided by invisible hands. Flames appeared along the edges of the room, dancing without heat, forming images of the night Adesuwa was burned. Her pleading eyes glowed within each flicker of fire, a reminder that no escape existed. The smoke carried a faint, sweet scent, almost mocking in its familiarity, forcing them to inhale memories they had tried to bury. The night stretched on, every second a lifetime of terror. Adesuwa's figure moved among them, quiet but relentless, watching, judging, ensuring that each of them felt the full weight of their sin. Even in the absence of words, even without touching, she was pain made flesh, sorrow made manifest. Outside, Aya Mornike pressed her palms to the earth, whispering fervent prayers, sensing that the spirit had moved from grief to vengeance and would not stop until justice had been fully exacted. By dawn, the family sat trembling, broken, and silent. Their bodies were intact, but the soul is fragile, and tonight it had been shattered. The fire had returned, not to burn, but to teach, to punish, to make them feel the cruelty they had inflicted. And in the corners of the house, shadows still whispered her name, Adesuwa. The house had become unrecognizable. Walls groaned under the weight of unseen forces, floorboards bent as though carrying centuries of sorrow, and the air itself seemed to pulse with memory. Mama Kimmy sat huddled on the floor, shivering violently, her eyes darting at every shadow, expecting it to take human form. Baba Tund crouched beside her, silent and trembling, praying with hands pressed together so tightly his knuckles were white. Sola could barely breathe, feeling the pull of something unseen pressing into his chest, something that demanded acknowledgement and could not be ignored. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. A cold, unnatural wind swept through the house, extinguishing lamps and rattling doors. In the main hall, a faint glow appeared, growing stronger, forming a small, trembling figure, the outline of Adesuwa as she had been burned. Her hair hung matted, clothes tattered, eyes wide with grief and fury, and her skin, though scarred in memory, glowed with an otherworldly light. The shadows behind her twisted and coiled, taking shapes of fire, smoke, and screams. The house seemed to pulse with the memory of her suffering. Mama Kimmy screamed, clawing at the floor as if she could tear away the scene from reality itself. The image of the fire that had consumed Adesuwa appeared around them, replaying the events of that fateful night in horrifying detail. Each flicker of flame carried her screams, each wisp of smoke smelled of burnt flesh, and every shadow reflected the terror in her eyes. Baba Tund collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably, tears carving deep lines into his cheeks. He could not look away, could not escape, could not plead. Adesuwa's gaze held him prisoner, forcing him to relive every moment he had ignored her cries. Sola screamed aloud when he saw the invisible flames encircle the family, each spark forming her small body writhing in agony. He felt her sorrow pressing down, bending his spine and crushing his heart. The room seemed to stretch and contract with every echo of her cries. He wanted to run, to hide, to stop the vision, but his feet refused to move. He had watched silently as a child, and now, the spirit demanded that he understand fully the weight of that silence. Adesuwa's voice finally broke through the scene, soft but commanding, carrying the pain and power of a soul denied peace. "Do you see now?" she asked, her voice echoing in every corner of the house. "Do you see what you did? Do you see what it cost me to trust you?" Mama Kimmy's body shook violently. Baba Tund whimpered, barely able to breathe. Even Sola, though young, felt a deep understanding settle into his chest, a recognition that justice had arrived, and it was merciless. The flames flickered, the shadows twisted, and the smell of smoke became overwhelming. Adesuwa's form drifted closer, small yet immense, her presence filling the room completely. She did not touch them, but the weight of her sorrow pressed into their hearts like fire through bone. They could feel every second of her agony as though it were their own, every plea ignored replayed again and again, until no part of their souls could remain unmarked. When she finally faded, the room was silent except for their sobs. The fire was gone, the shadows settled, but the memory lingered, burned into their minds and hearts. The family sat broken, no longer able to deny, no longer able to escape. Adesuwa had forced them to witness the full scope of her suffering, and the lesson had been seared into them forever. Outside, Aya Mornike pressed her hands to the earth and whispered again, feeling the pulse of Adesuwa's spirit vibrating through the soil. "She will not rest until justice is complete," she murmured, watching the faint glow of the house through the trees. The night ended, but nothing would ever be the same. By the following night, fear had fully claimed the family. The walls themselves seemed alive, whispering, shifting, reminding them of every act they had committed against Adesuwa. Mama Kemi no longer dared to move through the house without trembling, her feet dragging as if the shadows themselves had weight. Baba Tund could not speak without choking on his own guilt. Sola had stopped sleeping entirely, sitting by the doorway with wide, haunted eyes, waiting for the next wave of the girl's vengeance. Adesuwa began targeting them individually. That night, Mama Kemi awoke to the sound of soft crying in her room, delicate, sorrowful, unbearable. She turned and saw Adesuwa sitting on her bed, small, fragile, but her eyes piercing with grief and anger. Mama Kemi tried to scream, tried to flee, but her legs refused to move. The girl's form seemed to expand, filling the room with a weight of sorrow that pressed down on Mama Kemi's chest, making it impossible to breathe. The shadows moved around her, coiling like serpents, tightening with every heartbeat. Baba Tun's punishment was equally merciless. As he lit the evening lamp, it flared violently, casting his shadow on the walls in horrifying, distorted forms. Within the firelight, Adesuwa's figure appeared again and again, small yet commanding, her eyes accusing, replaying the moment he had abandoned her to the flames. The images were so vivid, so real, that he fell to the floor, clutching his head as though trying to tear the visions from his mind. Each flicker of fire was a memory of her suffering, forcing him to relive the agony he had ignored. Sola, though young, faced his own reckoning. As he sat in the corner, the shadows in the room coalesced into her form, moving slowly toward him. Her gaze softened for a brief moment, filled with sorrow rather than anger, but the moment passed. The shadows shifted into flames, not burning, but circling him like a cage. He could hear her whispering, "You saw? You did nothing. Do you understand now?" Each word cut into his heart, leaving invisible scars, shaping him into someone who could never forget injustice. By the time the night ended, each of them was trapped in a personal hell. Mama Kemi clutched herself, crying silently, haunted by the weight of sorrow pressing her to the floor. Baba Tund lay prostrate, unable to speak, unable to move, every nerve screaming from the memories imposed by the spirit. Sola rocked back and forth, tears streaming freely, listening to the whispers echoing in the corners, the shadows moving just out of sight, feeling the hand of justice in every flicker of light and shadow. Outside, Aya Mornike could feel the pulse of Adesuwa's power through the soil, a steady, unyielding force that promised punishment and demanded recognition. "She is patient," Aya Mornike murmured, her voice trembling. "She will take her due, and no one who harmed her will escape her judgment." The house, now cursed, no longer belonged solely to the living. Adesuwa's spirit had claimed it as a vessel of memory, grief, and justice. And as night after night passed, the family realized they could no longer hide, no longer run, no longer deny. The fire that had claimed her life had returned in spirit, and it would not rest. The nights had grown unbearable. The air in the house vibrated with a presence too powerful to ignore. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending walls and ceilings into impossible shapes. The faint smell of smoke lingered constantly, even where no fire burned, curling into every corner like a reminder that what had been done could never be undone. Mama Kemi huddled in her room, shaking, unable to leave, feeling invisible hands pressing against her shoulders, squeezing, reminding her of the hands that had once done nothing as Adesuwa cried. Baba Tund experienced a torment deeper than fear. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flames that had consumed Adesuwa, the smoke curling around her small body, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth opening to scream, only for the sound to be stolen by silence. Each vision struck him as though he were there, feeling every searing heat, every unbearable burn, every second of helplessness. His mind became a prison, his guilt a cage, and every heartbeat echoed with the faint, sorrowful whisper, "Why did you let it happen?" Sola, too, was trapped in her psychological grip. Shadows moved around him in the corners of his vision, forming shapes that replayed the moments he had watched silently, powerless. He heard her voice, gentle yet accusing. "I trusted you. You did nothing." The words were not loud, but they wrapped around his mind, forming chains of memory that refused to break. Every time he blinked, he saw her burned face, her pleading eyes, her agony reborn in shadows and fire, pressing into his chest with a weight no child should carry. That night, the house itself became an extension of Adesuwa's presence. Objects moved without hands, pots rattled, doors slammed, chairs tipped over. Flames flickered along the walls without consuming them, forming shapes of Adesuwa writhing in pain, her eyes fixed on the living as though holding them accountable. Every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind, every faint smell of smoke became a message: justice will not rest. Mama Kimmy fell to her knees in the hallway, gasping, clawing at the floor, as if she could tear the memories from reality itself. Baba Tund collapsed beside her, shivering violently, silent except for the soft moans of despair. Sola sat on the steps to the kitchen, tears streaking his cheeks, unable to move or look away. The shadows twisted around them, forming cages, chains, and walls, pressing memories into their minds until the weight of guilt became physical, until every nerve burned with the sorrow of the girl they had burned. Outside, Aya Mornike felt the pulse of Adesuwa's power. She pressed her palms to the earth, whispering prayers to the ancestors, feeling the energy move from the compound outwards, like ripples from a stone dropped into water. The spirit's wrath was no longer subtle. It was alive, patient, and relentless. Justice had begun to touch their very minds, and nothing in the living world could stop it. By dawn, the family was broken in ways that went beyond the body. Their eyes were haunted, their movements hesitant, their hearts carrying the weight of a grief that was not theirs but demanded to be felt. Adesuwa's presence lingered, unseen yet undeniable, promising that the torment would escalate until true reckoning had been achieved. The house trembled that night, as though the very walls remembered Adesuwa's screams. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the faint, bitter smell of smoke, and shadows crawled along the ceilings like living things. Mama Kimmy huddled in a corner, her wrapper clutched tight around her, shivering as whispers coiled around her ears. "Do you see now? Do you feel it?" The voice was soft yet cutting, piercing deeper than any flame ever could. Baba Tund's body shook uncontrollably as the floor beneath him seemed to pulse with energy. Each heartbeat echoed in the room like a drum, matching the rhythm of Adesuwa's sorrow. Suddenly, flames appeared along the walls, dancing, twisting, yet producing no heat. They formed images of her death, small hands reaching, pleading eyes wide with terror, the agony that had been denied, and the moment she had been pushed into fire. Baba Tund fell forward, covering his face, trying to shut it out, but the flames reflected in every mirror, every polished surface, making escape impossible. Sola could feel her presence beside him, solid and heavy despite her ghostly form. Shadows lengthened, curling around him, pressing with weight he had never known. He wanted to scream, but his voice failed, choked by terror. A hand, invisible but undeniable, seemed to brush his shoulder, cold as ice, forcing him to feel every second of her suffering as if it were his own. The whispers grew louder, circling him. "You did nothing. You watched. You ignored. Do you understand?" Mama Kimmy attempted to flee, stumbling through the hallway, but the shadows twisted around her legs, tripping her, pushing her down. The flames along the walls danced closer, forming shapes that writhed and moaned, echoing the pain of that night. She screamed, clawing at the floor, begging for mercy that would not come. The house had become a vessel for Adesuwa's grief and wrath, each room replaying her death, each shadow a reminder of the lives she had touched and the injustice that had been done. Baba Tund tried to reach Sola, but the air thickened, pressing against his chest, suffocating him. He fell to his knees as visions of Adesuwa burning flashed before his eyes, accompanied by the smell of smoke and ash so vivid it made him gag. The whispers coiled tighter, echoing through the house, circling the family, ensuring they could not escape, ensuring every nerve felt the weight of sorrow and punishment. Outside, Ayamornike felt the pulse of Adesuwa's spirit radiating outward, trembling the earth beneath her feet. She pressed her palms to the soil, murmuring to the ancestors, feeling the girl's anger and grief as a force that could not be denied. The living must see the weight of their sin, she whispered, knowing that only through full reckoning could the restless spirit be satisfied. By the time dawn arrived, the house was silent, but the air was heavy with the memory of what had occurred. Shadows lingered unnaturally in corners, and even as the sun rose, Mama Kimi, Baba Tund, and Sola remained paralyzed with terror. They had learned a bitter truth. Adesuwa's revenge was no longer subtle. It was here, unstoppable and infinitely patient. The walls groaned as though alive. Doors slammed without wind, and floors seemed to shift beneath their feet. Mama Kimi clutched Sola, whispering prayers, but the shadows only pressed closer, curling around them, mocking their fear. Baba Tund tried to step forward, but the hallway elongated impossibly, turning their familiar house into a labyrinth of terror. Adesuwa appeared at the end of the corridor, small and glowing, but with a presence that weighed tons. Her eyes bore into them, sorrow and fury entwined. "You cannot hide," she whispered, her voice threading through the walls, through the floor, into their bones. A chair flew across the hall, narrowly missing Baba Tund. Lamps flickered violently. Every object moved as if obeying her will, creating a living nightmare. The family realized they were trapped not just by walls, but by her spirit. The house itself had become her weapon. Sola trembled as he saw her silhouette reflected in every window. She drifted closer, silent, carrying the memory of her burning, her pleading, her death. And in that silence, they understood, their home would never feel safe again. Mama Kimi fell to her knees, sobbing, whispering, "Forgive me, Adesuwa, please." But the spirit only tilted her head, sorrowful, waiting for justice to reach its full course. The night had grown heavy, almost suffocating. Mama Kimi shivered in the hallway, clutching Sola to her chest, as the air around them grew thick with the faint smell of smoke. Shadows moved unnaturally along the walls, stretching and curling like dark fingers reaching for them. Every creak of the floorboards sounded deliberate, echoing her heartbeat and reminding her of Adesuwa's last cries. Baba Tund entered the hall, trembling, and nearly fell as a chair slid across the floor on its own, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. Lamps flickered violently, casting distorted reflections on the ceiling. Then the stove burst into flame, bright but cold, and the utensils rattled and fell. Each movement of the house seemed guided by the girl's spirit, a physical reminder that they were being watched and punished. Sola crouched low, covering his ears, but whispers penetrated his mind like icy knives. "You saw? You did nothing. Why?" He could hear her voice, soft yet full of accusation. The shadows wrapped around him, brushing against his arms and legs as if forcing him to feel every ounce of sorrow and terror that had been inflicted upon Adesuwa. He trembled violently, realizing the consequences of silence could reach even the innocent. Mama Kimi tried to run, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, walls bending unnaturally. She stumbled and fell, catching a glimpse of Adesuwa's burned face reflected in the polished floor. The sight stole her breath, and she collapsed completely, sobbing, unable to escape the memories of what they had done. Baba Tund fell beside her, shaking and sobbing uncontrollably. Every shadow in the room coiled tighter, pressing in on him, echoing images of the fire, her pleading, and her pain. For the first time, he felt her agony, as if it were his own. The family understood clearly. Their house had become a vessel of judgment, and there was no hiding from the past they had tried to bury. The night was silent at first, but every creak of the house carried weight. Shadows flickered along walls as if alive. Mama Kemi sat on the floor, arms wrapped around Sola, hearing soft whispers in every corner. You left me to burn, why? Each repetition pressed into her mind, reminding her that silence and inaction had consequences. Baba Tund tried to pray, but the words twisted in his throat. The shadows thickened around him, coiling like snakes. Each flicker of the lamp cast shapes of Adesuwa's burning body across the walls, and his knees buckled under the weight of memory. Sola hid under his mother's arms, shivering as the whispers circled him. They were everywhere, on the floorboards, in the walls, even in the faint wind brushing the windows. The soft, accusing voice haunted him, leaving a mark on his young mind. The house seemed alive, responding to their fear. Doors slammed, objects shifted, and the floorboards creaked in rhythm with the whispers. Each sound forced the family to confront the agony they had caused, replaying the past like a living nightmare. By dawn, exhaustion claimed them. Their eyes were hollow, hearts heavy, and even the first light of day could not chase away the presence that had entered their home. The justice of a spirit denied peace. Every mirror in the house reflected more than their faces. Baba Tund, Mama Kemi, and Sola each saw Adesuwa's burned form staring back, her eyes wide with grief and accusation. The mirrors no longer reflected the present. They reflected her death, replaying the moments she had begged for mercy, each second a blade piercing their hearts. Baba Tund fell to his knees, sobbing, unable to turn away from the reflections. He could smell the smoke, feel the heat that never truly existed, hear her screams piercing the glass and his soul. Mama Kemi tried to cover her eyes, but every polished surface in the house caught her reflection, reminding her that no corner could hide guilt. Even Sola, young and innocent, saw her small, pleading hands reaching through the glass, making him understand the full weight of silence. The mirrors became weapons of memory, replaying the horror in endless loops. The family realized that their past could not be erased. Every reflection, every flicker of light, carried her presence. By nightfall, they understood. Even in mirrors, Adesuwa had claimed power, making sure their guilt was unavoidable and constant. The shadows in the hallways lengthened unnaturally, twisting into shapes that resembled chains. Each family member felt them wrap around their limbs, binding them to the house, to each other, and to the memory of what they had done. Every heartbeat echoed in time, with the unseen chains tightening. Baba Tund could barely stand. Mama Kemi sobbed silently, feeling invisible pressure on her chest. Sola whimpered, clutching his mother, sensing the weight of injustice pressing down on them like tangible force. Adesuwa appeared briefly in the shadows, small but impossibly commanding. Her eyes carried sorrow and fury, and her presence alone tightened the spectral chains further. The house responded to her will, groaning and shifting, bending reality to keep the guilty trapped. No room offered safety. The shadows coiled from one room to another, chasing them, keeping them aware of their inescapable punishment. By the morning, exhaustion and terror had etched deep lines into their faces. Every move, every breath, reminded them that Adesuwa's revenge had begun in earnest. For one night, Adesuwa appeared silent, hovering above the hall floor. Her presence was still, but the weight of sorrow she carried pressed on the family as if physically holding them down. Mama Kemi, Baba Tund, and Sola could feel her judgment without a single word. The silence was more terrifying than screams, more oppressive than fire. Every shadow in the room seemed to lean toward them, whispering truths they could not escape. Even Sola, young and innocent, felt the enormity of her grief. The spirit's gaze was heavy, reminding them that injustice left scars that could not heal. By dawn, the house felt alive with her presence, a constant reminder that vengeance did not always shout. It sometimes waited, patient and merciless. The firewood Adesuwa had dyed overglowed faintly, pulsing with unnatural light. As Baba Tund approached, the flames rose, forming shapes of her agony. Her small figure burned again and again, pleading for mercy, screaming silently, and accusing them through the fire's glow. Mama Kemi could not bear to look, but the smell of smoke and ash filled the room, curling around them like living fingers. Sola covered his eyes, but felt the heatless flames press into his chest, forcing him to feel her suffering. The firewood became a symbol, her memory, her pain, and her justice were alive, and they would never be able to ignore it. Adesuwa began targeting each family member individually. Shadows followed Mama Kemi everywhere, whispering her guilt in soft, accusing tones. Baba Tund relived his inaction in terrifying visions of flames and pleading eyes. Sola's dreams became haunted by her small figure, circling, watching, demanding understanding. The house shifted to accommodate each torment. Doors elongated, hallways twisted, ceilings lowered. They could not hide from her presence. Each room became a personal courtroom of sorrow. One night, Adesuwa's anger became visible in the form of glowing eyes and twisting shadows. Objects flew across rooms, furniture toppled, and lamps burst into flame without heat. She circled the family silently, each step leaving traces of ash and smoke. Mama Kemi screamed, clutching Sola, while Baba Tund collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Each flame, each shadow, each movement reminded them of the night she burned, forcing them to live every second of her suffering. Even outside, the village felt the unrest. Winds carried whispers, faint cries, and the smell of smoke into the streets, warning everyone of the spirit's presence. By this night, the family realized Adesuwa's power had grown beyond the house. Mirrors reflected not just her death, but the sins of the living, making them feel trapped everywhere. Shadows became her eyes, watching, judging, never letting them rest. Sola fell silent, hugging his knees, understanding that no child's innocence could shield him from the truth. Mama Kemi and Baba Tund sobbed, broken, knowing the spirit had begun her final reckoning. The night closed over them like a shroud, and in the corners of the house, faint whispers echoed. Justice will not rest until it is complete. The house groaned and shook violently. Floors cracked, ceilings creaked, and walls twisted as if bending to Adesuwa's will. Objects flew across rooms, toppling furniture, shattering glass, and filling the air with smoke and dust. The family huddled together, terrified, realizing their home had become her weapon. Shadows coiled like snakes, wrapping around their bodies, pressing down with the weight of every injustice. Mama Kemi could barely breathe. Baba Tund's knees buckled, and Sola trembled silently, feeling the presence of the girl who had once been innocent. Adesuwa appeared above them, her small figure glowing with an otherworldly fire. Her eyes carried the sorrow of 1,000 nights, the anger of a life stolen, and the power of justice denied. The house shuddered with her presence, as though it had become an extension of her will. Adesuwa's voice echoed through every corner of the house. "You cannot hide," she whispered. Visions of her pleading, screaming, and burning appeared on walls, mirrors, and shadows. The family could no longer escape their guilt. They were forced to witness the full horror of what they had done. Mama Kemi cried, clutching Sola tightly. Baba Tund's face was wet with tears as he fell to his knees. Even Sola understood for the first time that inaction had consequences, that cruelty, no matter how hidden, could never go unanswered. The shadows and flames twisted together, replaying her death in vivid detail. The house itself became a courtroom, and the guilty had no defense. Adesuwa began punishing each family member differently. Mama Kemi was forced to relive her betrayal repeatedly, shadows pressing on her chest, whispering every lie and act of cruelty. Baba Tund's visions became unbearable, flames circling him, showing the moment she burned and his helpless inaction. Each flicker of fire carved guilt deeper into his mind. Sola was haunted by her pleading eyes and shadows, forcing him to understand the weight of innocence ignored. Even his young mind could not escape the lessons of cruelty and silence. The entire house became a living nightmare. Doors bent and twisted, hallways stretched, and ceilings seemed to lower like a trap. Flames danced along walls, forming images of her death. Shadows coiled like snakes, whispering accusations in every room. The family could not hide, could not escape, could not sleep. Every step carried them closer to understanding the full force of Adesuwa's wrath. Adesuwa appeared in full form, hovering in the middle of the hall. Her small frame radiated sorrow and anger. She raised her hand, and the shadows tightened. The air burned with invisible fire. Mama Kemi and Baba Tund cried uncontrollably. Sola trembled, realizing the spirit's patience had run out. Adesuwa was no longer subtle. Her vengeance would be absolute. The house shook violently. Shadows pressed, and flames twisted into shapes of her burned body. Each family member was trapped in a corner of their own guilt. Adesuwa's voice filled the house. Feel the weight of what you have done. Remember me. Remember the fire. Remember the pain. They fell to the ground, broken and pleading, knowing that this was the culmination of her revenge. Even outside, the village felt her presence. Winds carried whispers of her suffering. Shadows seemed to move among the trees, and villagers reported strange lights over the house. Adesuwa's wrath was no longer confined to the family. Her story demanded attention, a warning for all. Ayamornike whispered to the ancestors, feeling the power surge. Justice will be done. She will not be ignored. By the next night, Mama Kemi, Baba Tund, and Solo were fully broken. Their bodies and minds trembled with terror. Flames and shadows circled them, replaying her death, her suffering, and her pleading. Adesuwa's small figure hovered above them. Calm now, the fury in her eyes balanced with sorrow. The family had been forced to understand their cruelty fully. For the first time, silence filled the house. The shadows receded, the flames vanished, and the air grew lighter. Adesuwa appeared before them, small and radiant, sorrowful yet serene. She whispered, "Justice is done. Remember me, and never harm another innocent soul." With that, she faded into the night, leaving only faint ash and the smell of smoke. The house was empty, the spirits of the wronged finally at peace. The family sat in silence, hearts heavy, bodies trembling. They were alive, but forever changed. Sola held his mother's hand tightly, understanding cruelty and injustice in a way no child should. Mama Kemi and Baba Tun sobbed silently, knowing the full cost of their actions. The village remained wary, and the story of Adesuwa spread as a warning. Injustice may be hidden, but it cannot escape the fire of vengeance. Outside, the wind carried a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "I am not forgotten. Remember me." The house was quiet now, but the memory of Adesuwa, her sorrow, and her justice lingered forever. Please subscribe, share, like, and comment for more videos.